If you stand on the edge of Hoover Dam right now and look down, you're not actually looking at a lake. You're looking at a warning. There's a massive white ring wrapped around the canyon walls of Lake Mead. It's taller than the Statue of Liberty, totally bleached, and it looks like a mountain-sized bathtub stain. Every single foot of that chalky line represents water that used to be there and just isn't anymore. We are looking at a 160 feet of dead rock between where the water sits today and where it sat when people used to drive out to see the eighth wonder of the world. That ring is the whole story. Everything else is just the math catching up. 40 million people rely on the Colorado River for drinking water. California's Imperial Valley uses it to grow the lettuce on your winter plate. Las Vegas glows because of it, and Phoenix sprawls into the desert on the promise of it. But the two giant reservoirs holding the whole operation together, Lake Mead and Lake Powell, are draining toward a threshold that engineers explicitly built them to avoid. They gave this point a name that sounds like a movie title, Deadpool. And recently, for the first time since the concrete was poured, that phrase stopped being a hypothetical. Most people think a drought is just a couple of hot summers. This isn't that. This is a slow-motion breakdown of the plumbing that built the American West. The terrifying part isn't just that the water is running low, it's the exact order in which things break. Start upstream at Lake Powell on the Utah-Arizona border. The reservoir dropped down to 26% capacity. In the 60-plus years since the government started filling it behind Glen Canyon Dam, the water had never fallen to 3,490 feet above sea level. That's the exact point where the dam's 8 turbines lose the ability to spin. Hydropower simply shuts off. The Bureau of Reclamation's own studies projected Powell would cross that line. And here's the detail that should stop you cold. The West loses electrical power roughly 120 feet before it actually runs out of water. The dam goes dark long before it goes dry. Those turbines humming inside Glen Canyon don't just keep lights on in nearby towns. The money generated from that electricity is the operational budget used to manage the river for all 40 million people downstream. Taking away the power is like taking away the steering wheel while the car is cruising at 70 miles an hour. Now follow what's left of the water down. Whatever leaves Glen Canyon travels through the Grand Canyon and dumps into Lake Mead, the massive reservoir created by Hoover Dam back in the 1930s. Mead is basically drinking from a straw connected to a bucket that's already nearly empty. When Powell can't send down enough water, Mead drops even faster. The two lakes are chained together, so one drags the other right down with it. Think about what Hoover Dam originally represented. In 1935, this was a massive statement. Over 700 feet of concrete wedged into Black Canyon, holding back a lake that stretched over 100 miles. Men died building it. They poured concrete around the clock, and if they had poured it all at once, it would have taken 100 years to cool off. The dam was proof that we could bend a giant river to our will. That was the promise, and now that promise is sitting there watching its own water evaporate. To understand how this happened, you have to picture a hotel room back in 1922. 11 men, 7 states, and a federal commissioner named Herbert Hoover sat down to split up the Colorado River. They made one massive error that we're still paying for a century later. They measured the river's flow during some of the wettest years in recorded history. They assumed the Colorado carried about 17.5 million acre-feet of water every year, and they divided it up based on that number. Upper states get a share, lower states get a share, and later, Mexico got a piece by treaty. Except the river almost never actually ran with 17.5 million acre-feet. Tree ring data going back centuries shows the real long-term average is closer to 13 or 14 million. They split up water that didn't exist. They wrote a check the river could never cash, and every state, farm, and city built their entire future around numbers that were flawed from the day they were written down. That's the core deficit underneath everything. For decades, it didn't seem to matter because the reservoirs were full. You can run a huge deficit when you have a savings account as big as Lake Mead. But that savings account is nearly drained. A single year where the river delivers only a third of its average flow can wipe out a good winter's snowpack instantly. Look back at that white ring on the canyon wall. The high water mark sits at 1,229 feet of elevation from from its peak in the 1980s. Today, the water level sits way below that, exposing a pale mineral scar across the landscape. Marinas that used to float on deep water are sitting on cracked mud. At Hemingway Harbor, workers have had to extend the boat ramps over and over, essentially chasing the receding shoreline down the hill. As the lake drops, the loss of water speeds up. Lake Mead is shaped like a giant bowl that tapers down at the bottom. Near the top, a 1-foot drop takes a massive volume of water because the lake is so wide. But down near the bottom, where it narrows, that same 1-foot drop requires much less water loss. That means as the lake level falls, the drop in height accelerates for the same amount of water leaving. The lower it gets, the faster the bottom comes up to meet you. Water managers track 3 specific floor levels that fail in sequence. First is the minimum power pool. That's the level where turbines can no longer make electricity reliably. Second is the lower outlet level, where getting water through the dam gets exponentially harder. Third is deadpool. That is the absolute bottom. Deadpool means the water level drops below the lowest outlet pipes in the dam. Water literally cannot pass through anymore. For Lake Powell, that's 3,370 feet. For Lake Mead, it's around 895 feet. If Hoover Dam hits deadpool, the water sitting behind it cannot get out to feed Las Vegas, Arizona, California, or Mexico. The dam stays standing, the remaining water sits trapped, and nothing flows downstream. It's not a metaphor, it's just a physical pipe with no water reaching the intake. The scary part is how these stages work. You lose the electrical power long before you lose the physical flow. The system designed to manage the problem breaks down before the water itself completely stops. States have been scrambling to make deals. 7 basin states recently negotiated emergency water transfers just to shift supply around and keep the Glen Canyon turbines above the cutoff line. These are the kinds of deals people make when the standard playbook stops working and everyone is improvising against the clock. Las Vegas, ironically enough, has become surprisingly good at this. Despite the neon and fountains, Southern Nevada recycles almost every drop of indoor water used on the Strip. You flush a toilet, the water gets treated, sent right back into Lake Mead. And the state gets a return credit for it. They banned decorative grass lawns and paid homeowners to tear them out. Vegas reduced its total river draw, even while adding hundreds of thousands of residents. If every region managed water like Las Vegas, the situation wouldn't look like this. But you can't recycle your way out of an over-allocated river. Conservation buys time, but it doesn't eliminate the fundamental math problem. Downstream is where the real consumption happens. The Imperial Irrigation District in Southern California holds the single largest share of Colorado River rights. Their claims are older than most major cities in the West. Farmers there grow winter vegetables for much of the country out in a desert using water piped through the All-American Canal. When people argue about cutting back, this is the friction point. Cities claim farms use way too much. Farmers point out that their legal rights predate the cities by decades. The legal framework governing the river was explicitly written to protect those senior rights above everything else. So you have a legal system saying the oldest rights get full water allocations no matter what, pitted against a physical river that literally doesn't have the water to give them. Eventually, either the legal agreements adapt, or the reservoir hits the bottom and the law becomes irrelevant because the pipes run dry. This isn't isolated to Lake Mead and Lake Powell either. It's happening across the entire regional infrastructure. Take Elephant Butte in New Mexico. Once the largest man-made lake on Earth, its levels recently crashed down to single-digit percentages after consecutive dry years and early snowmelts. An entire town had its docks settle right into the mud. Local chili farmers were rationed down to just 4 inches of water, and legal settlements are already planning for some of those farms to be permanently retired. Or look at Medina Lake in Texas. It dropped down to 4% capacity. Docks sit stranded dozens of feet above dry ground. A local data investigation found that 75% of the water released from the lake never even reached the farms it was meant for. It simply soaked into 110-year-old dirt canals and disappeared into the ground. The pattern is obvious. It isn't just that rain stopped falling. The infrastructure built a century ago, the dirt canals, the regional compacts, and the baseline assumptions, are losing water faster than nature can replace it. The West was engineered for a wetter era using numbers that were wrong from the start. People always ask why a few good winters can't just fill everything back up. First, the hole is just too big. Refilling Mead and Powell would take years of well above average snowpack in the Rockies back to back without a single dry year in between. That almost never happens in the historical record. A great snowpack year barely moves the needle before a single dry year wipes out all the gains. The empty space in those reservoirs is just too vast. Second, the dirt itself is drier. Decades of heat have dried out the soil in the upper watershed so deeply that when snow melts in the spring, the parched ground drinks up the moisture before it ever reaches the riverbed. Scientists call this a soil moisture deficit. Decades ago, snowmelt ran straight into streams. Today, the dry earth gets first dibs, and the river gets whatever is left over. The same amount of snow simply yields less actual river water than it used to. If Lake Mead ever reaches deadpool, the impact won't look like a sudden movie disaster. It's quieter than that. A canal carries less water, then runs dry. A farm gets a fraction of its expected delivery, then zero. A city relies heavier on underground aquifers that are already being overpumped. Legal battles turn into state disputes that end up in the Supreme Court. The collapse is administrative long before the faucets completely stop. Water doesn't just disappear. It just stops being available to the places that were promised it. We built an incredible network of infrastructure across the West. Dams, canals, and pipelines turned arid deserts into agricultural hubs in massive cities. But the whole setup was calibrated around a river that was measured wrong during an unusually wet era. The engineering was impressive, but the baseline assumptions were flawed. The negotiators who sat in that room in 1922 weren't stupid, they were just optimistic. They looked at a full river during a wet decade, assumed that was normal, and built a civilization around it. Now we're left standing on boat ramps that end in dirt, watching the white ring climb a little higher up the rock wall. Maybe states pull off more emergency deals to keep the power generators spinning a bit longer. Maybe a lucky stretch of winter storms buys another decade. Maybe farms get bought out. Cities cut consumption further. And the region manages a slow reduction instead of a sharp crisis. Even in that best-case scenario, the West becomes permanently drier and far more restricted on water than it has ever been. Strip away the politics, the legal fights, and the projections, and you're left with a basic physical reality. There is a lake behind a dam. There is a floor at the bottom of that lake. And the water level is closer to that floor than it has been since the day the concrete was poured. The dam will keep standing for centuries. Concrete doesn't care. But one day, the water might simply stop flowing out the other side.